Thank you. Welcome, Ambassador. Good to see you. I don't know how many years this is that I've been invited to this event, and it's always amazing for me because generally my interviews are in 5-minute chunks and you can only get so far in them. I keep getting invited back, and I always worry about the next panel that I'm about to do or the next fireside chat, whether that's going to be the last one. And I worried a little bit about this one, not because of you. Congratulations on your posting here. But because I have abiding questions about the U.S. role in Qatar and the U.S. relationship in Qatar that was thrown under the bus, driven over, and stamped on, generally speaking, by the United States in the last few years. Now, the Qataris are very polite and understanding about the fact that that happened, but that happened. And if I were a Qatari official, and I'm not, clearly, but if I were, I'd be a little annoyed, and I'd want to know exactly what it is you, on behalf of the U.S. government, have to say to me to suggest that you'll actually be there the next time an aggressive neighbor decides they want to get into a fight. Because the United States, from my perspective as a journalist covering international affairs, wasn't there for a country that has been a stalwart ally to the United States for a long time.
Yeah, so Ali, thanks for being here. I'm excited to have this conversation as well. As you know, we hadn't had an ambassador here for 5.5 years before I showed up.
Yes.
But I would push back a little bit on your description of the relationship between Qatar and the United States. In fact, it was the strong relationship between Qatar and the United States, the strong working relationship, strong economic relationship, security relationship, that I think helped see that relationship through the blockade. Certainly, politics is something that is set apart. I'm not a politician, I'm a diplomat.
Sure.
But I will tell you that Al Udeid Air Base, with the thousands of personnel there, anyone who spent any time in Doha understands that the economic strength and connections of the relationship, though they're unofficial, actually maintain order in this relationship. And so, as you say, if I were a Qatari official, how you would feel, I know how the Qatari officials felt. I know that they were grateful for the connection that we had economically. I know that they were grateful for Al Udeid Air Base, the thousands of airmen, the interoperability, the assurance that our security concerns were their security concerns. I know that they were grateful for that. There's work to do. We've been having half of a conversation because there hasn't been a U.S. ambassador.
Right.
I think everyone in Doha knows, imminently available to be told how well we're doing or to be told off. And I'll tell you something that I do. Doha is a lot like Atlanta, Georgia, right? There's the old joke in the United States, if you die and go to heaven, there's a layover in Atlanta. Doha is a lot like that now. And so when the chairman of a House or Senate committee is flying to South Africa and has 2.5 hours at Hamad Airport in the middle of the night, I go to Hamad Airport in the middle of the night because I want to talk about this relationship. I want them to understand it. There has been a deficit of understanding, I think, in the United States about the importance of Qatar.
Right.
But we're alive to it now and awake to it. And my job and the job of the U.S. Embassy is to continue to tell that story and to make sure people understand the consequences of the decisions that they make and the opportunities that exist here every day.
And I don't want to underestimate the degree to which that relationship was very strong and now is strong again. But the reason we haven't had an ambassador here for 5 years, and the reason your predecessor left, was because of this tension, because the messaging wasn't clear, because when, and I know things have been largely smoothed over with a lot of people, but because when Saudi Arabia did something Saudi Arabia wasn't supposed to do, we didn't sit there and say to Saudi Arabia, don't do that to our really good ally, we're also allies with you. And I guess my fear is, because the Qataris, like everybody else, watch U.S. politics, how do you assure them what happened then isn't going to happen again?
Yeah, so that's a fantastic question, and one that I think about a lot. And here's the way you do it. The way you make a relationship transition-proof is to make sure, A, that those connections are growing, but also that you're talking about them, that you're showing your work at all times so that there's no misunderstanding. Whether an administration changes or new personnel show up, there's no misunderstanding of the importance of the relationship. What the Qataris do for us regionally, what they do on humanitarian assistance, what they've done in North Africa, those are stories that have to be told over and over and over again so that people understand them. And so we have skeptics show up here, whether it's someone in Congress or someone in or out of the administration, an NGO. I welcome that conversation. The more people who understand the importance and the complexity of this relationship, the better off we'll be no matter who is in charge in the United States.
How do you articulate that well? Because a lot of what the U.S. and Qatar does, and a lot of what Qatar does in the region, or as it relates to the topic that we're discussing this weekend, this few days here, a lot, terrorism and hostages, is like a background app. Right? Qatar acts as a background app to a lot of things. It's the place you go to solve problems, which makes it hard not just to communicate that to people you talk to, but to the American public. That Qatar is substantially more important to American interests than 10 out of 10 Americans would understand.
I think that's right. And there are two aspects of this that I like to think about that are helpful to Americans trying to understand Qatar. I'm from New Orleans. After Hurricane Katrina, the Mississippi Gulf Coast and New Orleans were absolutely devastated, as everyone knows. The Qataris pumped $100 million into those communities, into these tiny communities that had been ravaged. And so there are people in Pass Christian, Mississippi, and New Orleans that can find Qatar, tiny Qatar, on a map. Right? That's the impact Qatar has on just those communities. And they're doing it throughout the United States. We've got to tell that story. But here's the other thing that I think people do understand. In a lot of ways, Qatar is in a group of countries like Australia, like Colombia, who regionally have always had an outsized impact and allowed the United States to focus on other priorities. People understand that about Colombia and South America. People understand that about Australia and the Pacific. We've got to tell the story of Qatar here in the region. It can't be like a background app. It has to be understood that there are things the United States can do in the region only because Qatar does what it does in the region. And so, I've been here 7 months or so. I had the benefit of being Secretary Blinken's executive assistant and Secretary Pompeo's executive assistant before that. So lots of Washington experience. I speak that language, and I've got to continue to tell that story. It's so clear to me in the time that I've been here that Qatar has become a force for good, not just regionally, but globally as we look around, such a steadfast partner that we have to be undeterred in our telling the story over and over and over again. And so that's what we're trying to do.
How does that work in a world where, in any country this is the case, but in America there's only so much appetite for things that don't directly affect people. And the appetite as it relates to foreign news in America is probably mostly taken at the moment by Ukraine and some Russia, a little bit of China, maybe a dab of North Korea, and some Iran. And I guess this week, Israel-Palestine. How do you even get that story? What does success look like to you? If the president or the White House came to you and said, what sort of messaging would you like to get out to the American people about Qatar, what would you say?
So this is interesting to me because every one of those countries and issues that you've listed is a Qatari story. Right? Maybe not North Korea, but everything else you've listed, Russia, Ukraine, it was the Qataris who came out first. I remember the foreign minister saying that it was an act of aggression. On Syria, the Qataris have been absolutely steadfast in the notion that normalization with the Assad regime isn't on the table, right? And so on and on and on again. Whatever story Americans are interested, whatever story American politicians are interested in, there is a Qatari angle. I just was in the United States for 10 days or so, did a little bit of travel to places that don't think about Qatar a lot, like Tuscaloosa, Alabama. But I talked about Qatar for 36 hours in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, because that's what we have to do. But if they were interested in Russia, Ukraine, if they were interested in Israel, Palestine, if they wanted to talk about Palestinian aid and the work that Qatar does with Israel on humanitarian assistance in Gaza, like that's a story we can tell. And so your whole list, save North Korea, is about Qatar.
Right.
And so when you think about it like that, it's an easy story to tell.
Let's talk about, you said everybody stops on the way through to somewhere in Qatar. I remember in the time during the blockade, traveling through Qatar and everything taking longer because you flew north and into Iranian airspace. Yeah. And then, if I were going to Nairobi or Dar es Salaam, you flew north and around, added a couple hours to that created a situation which is probably pretty good for Qatar right now because it redeveloped relationships with Iran that it hadn't had for a long time. Tricky for America because at the same moment we were pulling out of our relationships with Iran, we now, in a world in which Iran is providing some of the most effective and lethal weapons to Russia during the Ukraine war, these Shahid drones, America has very little leverage with Iran today. Qatar has more. And in fact, the blockade either pushed or encouraged Qatar to have stronger relations with Iran at a time when its Gulf neighbors did not. What's the effect of that?
Well, I think that there's a broad conversation happening about Iran and with Iran. We're fortunate to have good friends in Qatar who have access and experience and a relationship that, as you know, grew during the blockade. I think you asked what the impact is. The impact is that we have someone who can emphasize the things that we think are important to us. We have someone who can listen when we're unable to listen. And so as part of our broader strategy, having more people who understand our interlocutors in this concern is better for us. We are concerned about threats. And to the extent that Qatar is able to help us manage those threats, diminish those threats, we are an open ear to a major non-NATO ally, and so we think it's a good thing. I would also point out, back to the idea that Qatar is a force for good in places that allow us to do more, that Qatar not only folds into the areas that we think are most important, they lead in places that are important to us as well. The maturation of this relationship means that we don't prescribe to Qatar what their foreign policy should be. They have a foreign policy, a rich and complex foreign policy, and there are lots of areas in that foreign policy where we can work together, and we're more than happy to follow the lead of our partner in places where they have great experience and great ideas. And so the maturation of this relationship has really been something to behold. But I also genuinely believe, and I'm a fan of US sports, and our professional sports have begun to think about upside. The NBA would rather take a one-and-done kid than a guy who played in college for 4 years because of upside. Qatar has so much upside. Even with all that they do, the space for us to grow this relationship, to learn from them, is absolutely massive.
Talk to me about I remember in 2014 when Crimea was invaded by Russia, and Europe was thinking about natural gas issues, and Poland was so far ahead than the rest of Europe because of a relationship with Qatar that had helped them build the necessary ports and the infrastructure to get natural gas. I was surprised in the intervening years that the rest of Europe didn't follow that lead, but Europe didn't follow that lead, and now is having to do that. And we'll meet with some success thanks to U.S. help. But what does that conversation look like? Are you involved in that conversation with Qatar about how do we provide natural gas to parts of the world that were getting their natural gas from Russia in order to try and end this war in Ukraine?
Well, Ali, you're a student of history, and you understand the globe as well as anyone I know. There are lots of countries that would have looked at Europe during this current crisis and said exactly that. You remember 2014? Like, you should have learned your lesson. Right. That's not Qatar. It's not how they operate. The fact that the ConocoPhillips deal with Germany is providing natural gas, is looking to the future, that they have found space that no one thought existed given their long-term contracts to Asia. This is not a time for finger pointing or finger wagging. The Qataris have taken seriously the crisis in Europe, and they have found ways to provide. The truth is that I think the whole world has learned a lesson at this point.
One would hope.
Or would hope
Yeah.
that the whole world has learned a lesson. But Qatar doesn't get stuck on would've or should've or
Right.
could've. Qatar is interested in how do we help people survive, a warmer winter than we thought we were going to have, but Qatar was right there immediately trying to find a way to provide natural gas to Europe.
Right, because the warm or cold winter still requires the same infrastructure. You
Exactly.
still have to have the ports and you still have to have the pipelines.
Exactly, and so this is important because you asked about the United States. This deal for gas to Europe was not an invention of the United States. We have great people working on energy, obviously. Amos Hochstein does a tremendous job. But the Qataris were ready and available and looking for a way to be helpful with the right partner, and ConocoPhillips was it. And so, one of the also wonderful things I think about Qatar is that it is, I think, a new kind of government that doesn't have the recriminations of the past always on its mind. I think a thing that could have been said about the United States, 50 years ago, in the middle of the last century. But Qatar is open and optimistic, and I think unhindered by sort of the barnacles of history, and they've proven that and proven their ability to help the world move forward, the free world move forward with the help they've given Europe on gas.
Let's talk about another hot topic in the region, and that is Israel and Israel-Palestine. And I say them as two things because Israel's got its own standalone independent problems right now with the protests about its judicial change, and it's got a very dry tinderbox in the panel in the West Bank that could explode. Qatar is a country that has a great deal of involvement in the region. Some people are critical of the type of involvement Qatar has there. However, it is a way in to a world where America stepped back again the wrong way. Over the last, the prior 5 years to this administration, America just sort of left its seat at the table and in the eyes of many did more damage than good in the region. What kind of discussions are you having specifically with the Qataris about ways to bring the temperature down in Israel and the West Bank and Gaza?
Yeah, there are two ways in which the Qataris are helpful in this regard. First, the humanitarian assistance that they've always provided, they continue to provide. I think a decent amount of criticism of Qatar and their involvement in Israel, Palestine, and in Gaza is old. It's a vestige of the way the practice of providing this humanitarian assistance happened in the past, which is why I think we both agree the importance of having a U.S. ambassador here can't be overstated. I think at this point the operations for providing humanitarian assistance are pretty solid, and that's part of the story that we have to tell. I also think that Qatar is highly concerned with, as you put it, the tinderbox and the potential for conflict in the region. And so the Qataris are fully engaged. I know that Ambassador Al-Amadi travels frequently in the region to make sure that people understand that we may well be on the steps of difficulties in the region and in Israel and in Gaza and the West Bank as well. And so Qatar has taken it upon themselves to be something of a clarion call for what might happen next. And so they're not resting on their laurels with regard to humanitarian assistance and saying we're doing enough. They are involved in a conversation that they hope can ensure that tensions are tamped down.
There is very little in the United States that feels bipartisan these days, but there are a few things. There were Republicans who went to Kyiv right after Joe Biden was there to reinforce that the noise you hear back at home by some people is not true, that support for Israel is, support for Ukraine, I'm sorry, is a bipartisan effort in the United States. There are bipartisan efforts on, I was talking to some congressional staffers today on fentanyl going on in the United States. What is the situation with respect to our relationship, the U.S.'s relationship with Qatar?
So, yeah, so, I hate to be a one-trick pony on this. I optimistically and hopefully not naively believe that there is a deficit of information about who Qatar is and what Qatar does. And so there are still, as you point out, there are still officials back in the United States, politicians back in the United States who have a problem with Qatar. My hope is that those are genuine concerns and genuine critiques, because if they are, we can have a conversation
Good
about
faith
it.
conversations
Right,
that you can
we can have a
right.
conversation about it.
Right.
And not only that, we have a responsibility as the U.S. Embassy, as the U.S. Ambassador, I have a responsibility to hear from congressmen and women, senators, legislators, how they want this relationship to go. And so beyond just hearing those concerns, they have a role in foreign policy. And so it's part of my job to help fix some of those concerns. I think truly that a good bit of the critique is really just old messaging. And so I invite that conversation, but there is a lot of work to do. It's why I make the trips to the airport. Is because it doesn't matter whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, I'm going to come out and tell you the same story.
Right.
And so no matter what you go back and say, you will go back knowing how strong this relationship is with Qatar and the great potential it has for all of the things that we want to do. It's not unlike what we just talked about with Europe and gas. Even the most ardent critic of Qatar may find themselves in need at some point of Qatari support,
Right.
Qatari largesse with regard to humanitarian assistance. I would like, when they come around, to at least know just how strong this relationship is, and also give them a sense that if it's a good idea, if it's something that works within Qatar's foreign policy, it's something the Qataris will say yes to. And so the criticism is there. I welcome that criticism,
Right.
because it's an opportunity to tell the story.
If you had to list it, I'm just keeping an eye out. I got time for another question or two? Is that okay? All right, cool. If you were to list the benefits, I mean, we've discussed the gas supply, we've discussed influence in relations with the Palestinians, we've discussed over the course of the weekend, not you and I, but we've discussed over the course of this last few days, the relationship that we have with Qatar as it relates to the release of hostages or the control of terrorism. What's your selling point to Americans about why this even matters?
Yeah.
I mean, one could tell you, we haven't had an ambassador here for a while. Why does this matter?
So it's a great question. It's hard to add to your list. That list is why this matters. But as well as America comes out of the pandemic and looks around the world at where they want to go, thinking about who they want to be, the World Cup that we just saw the Qataris put on, inviting the world here, incident-free, maybe the best World Cup any of us has seen in our lifetime. They want to be open to sports tourism. They want to be a destination that works for Americans. It's an Arabic-speaking country where everyone speaks English. I need for America and American citizens to understand that this is a place that you can come and enjoy yourself for tourism. American businesses need to understand this is a place that you can come, create relationships, create corporations, and create opportunities that don't exist in other places. The PR for Qatar has to include all of us, has to include our explaining that this is a place that you might not have heard of or thought of, but it's a remarkable spot in the world, an isle of stability, of modernity, of culture. That's my selling point. My selling point is there are, I can think of 20 countries in the world that Americans might like to visit. They could visit Qatar instead and get what they were getting in those 20 countries.
So how does the conversation about democracy and human rights go?
Well, it's an ongoing conversation. It never goes away. One of the things that I'm sometimes concerned about is, there is so much good happening with Qatar right now that people get the impression that we don't have an ongoing conversation about human rights, labor rights, and democracy. On human rights and labor rights, and there's a lot of focus on this during the World Cup, Qatar's actually a leader in the region. It doesn't mean they're where they need to be, but it does mean they're thinking about it. One of the things I like to point out is that there's a lot of work that happened before the World Cup that people think was about the World Cup, but Qatar Vision 2030 is what Qataris have actually been working toward. The idea of human dignity, changing labor laws, which they have, a minimum wage law, the ability to change jobs and not have to leave the country. All of these are strides that the Qataris have made, and there's still more to do in their own vision, Qatar 2030. And so this is a conversation we have a lot and continue to have. This is not a relationship that is an immature relationship where we're only going to talk about happy things. You know the US government well. We have people who work on human rights and labor rights come through all the time. We have a human rights, labor rights, disability rights officer at the embassy who it's a full-time and a half job.
Right.
It's always a conversation to have. The Shura Council election that they had maybe 18 months ago is so unique in its potential for democracy. Not perfect the first time they did it, but the future of holding elections, it has such an outsized impact, the idea of voting. Listen, as an African American whose parents came from Mississippi, there were lots of years where voting was tough, and sometimes their votes didn't account to much.
Right.
And so I know from my family experience that if you keep doing it, if you keep going and voting, sooner or later the impact of that changes society. And so they've started down that road.
Well, I'm glad you're here. Ambassador, great to talk to you, great to meet you.
My pleasure.
And we wish you the best of luck in your continuing building of the relationship between the United States and Qatar.
I appreciate it. Thanks so much.
Ambassador Timmy Davis.
Thank you.